Drought destroyed everything. At 72 years old, Harold Whitmore stood alone in the middle of the corn farm his family had worked for 3 generations, watching thousands of dying stalks crumble beneath the hottest summer anyone could remember. The bank had already mailed its final foreclosure warning. His savings were gone. His neighbors had begun selling their land, and after paying one last overdue bill, he had only $49 left to his name. Instead of buying groceries or saving the money for another desperate week, Harold spent every last dollar on an old irrigation valve and a rusted box of forgotten farm tools that everyone at the clearance sale said belonged in the scrapyard. People laughed as he loaded them into his truck, shaking their heads and whispering that the old farmer had finally lost his mind. But 3 mornings later, before sunrise, Harold walked into his dying field and looked up to see something that shouldn't have existed, not during the worst drought in decades. A single dark cloud was hanging silently above one small corner of his farm. And when he stepped closer to find out why, he discovered something beneath the cracked earth that no one had touched in more than 70 years. What he uncovered would change not only his own future, but the fate of every struggling farmer in the valley. Before we continue this unforgettable story, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are right now. Leave a comment below so I can say hello to you. And if you're beginning a new day, I sincerely wish you good health, happiness, and a wonderful day ahead. If you enjoy inspiring stories about hope, family, and second chances, please subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and join us for more heartfelt journeys like this one. Harold Whitmore had spent 50 years believing that if he cared for the land would care for him. On this July morning, standing beneath a pale sky that hadn't offered meaningful rain in nearly 3 months, that belief felt as dry as the cracked earth beneath his boots. The cornfield stretching across his family's farm should have been shoulder-high by now. Rows of deep green leaves rustling in the summer breeze. Instead, brittle stalks leaned at awkward angles. Their curled leaves faded to a sickly gray-green. Every step Harold took sent dust swirling around his worn work boots. Even Duke, the aging border collie who had followed him through countless harvests, walked quietly with his nose low, as though he understood there was nothing left to chase. Harold knelt beside one struggling stalk and pressed his weathered hand against the soil. It crumbled between his fingers like dry flour. He had seen dry summers before. He had survived storms, floods, hail, and insects. But never this. Not like this. 3 generations of Whitmores had planted corn on these acres. His grandfather had cleared the first fields with horses. His father had expanded them after returning from the war. Harold had inherited not just the farm, but every sunrise, every aching muscle, every promise that the land would stay in the family. Now, at 72 years old, he feared he might become the one who lost it all. He pulled a folded envelope from his shirt pocket and stared at it again, though he already knew every word. The bank's final foreclosure notice was printed in cold, formal language that somehow felt crueler than shouting ever could. Unless payment arrangements were made within 30 days, the property would enter legal proceedings. Harold folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into his pocket. The paper had become soft from being opened so many times. Emily had begged him to come live with her weeks ago. "Dad," she had said over the phone, "it's just a farm. You're more important than the land." Harold had smiled sadly before answering, "To me, sweetheart, they're the same thing." He wasn't angry with her. Emily had built a good life teaching children in town. She worried because she loved him. But she hadn't grown up listening to stories about every fence post and every tree planted by family hands. Selling the farm wasn't simply moving away. It felt like erasing everyone who had come before him. Back inside the farmhouse, Harold counted the money in an old metal tin kept beside the kitchen window. 20, 30, 40, 45, $49. That was everything left after paying the overdue electric bill. He looked toward the refrigerator. There was enough food for several days. The old pickup still had half a tank of gas. $49 wasn't much, but it was something. Later that afternoon, he drove into town after hearing the local farm supply store was clearing out old inventory before closing its doors. Farmers wandered slowly through dusty shelves, buying discounted parts they hoped might keep aging equipment alive for another season. Harold moved quietly between the aisles until something caught his attention. On a low shelf sat an old brass irrigation valve beside a box filled with rusted hand tools. They looked forgotten, tagged together with faded clearance stickers. A handwritten sign read, "Entire box, $49. Harold picked up the valve, turning it carefully in his hands. It was old, but solid, built long before cheaper materials became common. The tools were worn, yet usable. He couldn't explain why, but something about them reminded him of his father's workshop, where nothing well-made was ever thrown away simply because it looked old. "Planning to irrigate with wishes?" someone joked behind him. Harold turned to see two local farmers grinning. One laughed softly. "There isn't enough water left in the county to run that thing." Another customer shook his head. "Should have spent that money on groceries instead." Harold smiled politely. "Maybe." The cashier glanced at the box as he rang it up. "You sure about this?" "Harold, nobody wanted these all month." Harold nodded. "Sometimes old things still have work left to do." The cashier accepted the last $49 Harold had in the world. As Harold carried the heavy box toward his truck, he heard quiet laughter behind him. Nobody meant real harm. They simply believed the drought had already won. Even Harold wasn't certain they were wrong. When he reached home, Emily's pickup was parked beside the farmhouse. She stepped out before he had shut off the engine. "Dad, please tell me you bought groceries." Harold lifted the old valve from the truck bed. Emily stared in disbelief. "You spent your last money on that." "It was a good valve once, she repeated gently. "Dad, you don't even have water to run through it." Harold rested the box on the porch. "Maybe not today." Emily's expression softened. She wrapped her arms around him, holding him tighter than she usually did. "I'm scared," she whispered. Harold hugged her back. "I know." They spent the evening repairing loose fence boards and checking equipment that probably wouldn't be needed if the drought continued. Before leaving, Emily stood beside her truck for a long moment. "Promise you'll call if things get worse?" Harold smiled. "I promise." Before sunrise the next morning, Harold walked into the eastern field carrying the old valve, hoping only to inspect an abandoned irrigation line his father had installed decades earlier. Duke suddenly stopped walking. The dog stared toward the far corner of the cornfield without making a sound. Harold looked up. Above one small patch of dying corn floated a single dark cloud. The rest of the sky was clear from horizon to horizon. He waited, expecting the breeze to push it away. It didn't move. It simply hung there, silent and still, directly above his land. Harold stood motionless for nearly a minute, his eyes fixed on the lone cloud suspended above the eastern corner of the field. The morning breeze brushed against his face, carrying dust across the dying rows of corn. Yet the cloud remained exactly where it was, neither growing nor drifting. Duke let out a low whine and stepped cautiously toward the patch beneath it. Harold followed, expecting at any moment for the cloud to disappear like an illusion created by exhaustion. Instead, it lingered. As he reached the edge of the shaded area, he noticed something even stranger. The corn there wasn't healthy, but it was alive. The leaves were still curled from the heat, yet they held a deeper shade of green than the rest of the field. Harold knelt and pushed his fingers into the soil. It resisted at first, then gave way. Beneath the dry crust, the dirt felt cool, damp. He frowned and dug a little deeper with his bare hand. Moist earth clung to his fingertips. It wasn't wet enough to form mud, but it was nothing like the powder-dry ground covering the rest of the farm. "How is that possible?" he whispered. Duke sniffed the ground before circling the patch once, his tail wagging slowly. Harold looked around. There were no broken water lines, no puddles, no leaking equipment. He had shut off every irrigation pipe weeks earlier because there was no water left to pump. Yet somehow this small corner of the field held moisture. The cloud stayed overhead until the rising sun brightened the sky. Then, almost unnoticed, it thinned into the morning light and disappeared. Harold remained where he was long after it was gone. He returned the next morning before sunrise. Again the cloud appeared over the same corner of the farm. Again it remained still while the rest of the sky stayed perfectly clear. This time he brought the old brass irrigation valve with him. Examining nearby pipes as he walked, most of the lines had rusted years ago. Nothing suggested recent use. Still, the soil beneath the mysterious patch remained cool below the surface. On the third morning, he wasn't alone. Ben Carter's pickup rolled slowly down the gravel lane just after dawn. Ben climbed out, adjusting his faded cap. "Emily told me you've been getting up before sunrise every day." Harold smiled faintly. "Thought I'd make sure I wasn't imagining things." Ben looked across the field. "Imagining what?" Harold pointed toward the eastern rows. Ben shaded his eyes. "Well, I'll be." The cloud hovered quietly above the same spot. Ben stared for several seconds before speaking again. "That's odd. You see it too?" "I sure do." They walked together into the field. Ben crouched beside Harold as he dug into the earth. When Harold handed him a handful of soil, Ben squeezed it between his fingers. "It's cooler and damp." Ben nodded slowly. "Not enough to save the crop, but enough that it shouldn't be here." Neither man had an explanation. Before leaving, Ben looked back once more at the fading cloud. "Don't tell too many people just yet," he said. "Folks are desperate enough already," Harold agreed. But strange things rarely stayed secret for long in a small farming community. That Saturday afternoon, Noah arrived with Emily. The 12-year-old climbed out of the truck, carrying an old digital camera hanging from his neck. "Mom said Grandpa found something unusual." Emily gave Harold an apologetic look. "I didn't tell him much." Harold smiled. "It's all right." Before sunrise the following morning, Noah waited excitedly beside Harold near the eastern field. The cloud appeared again, as faithfully as the sunrise itself. Noah quickly raised his camera and snapped several photographs. "It's only over your farm," he said. "Take another from farther back," Harold suggested. Noah walked several yards away and photographed the horizon. Every picture showed the same thing, a single cloud floating above one small section of the Whitmore property, while blue sky stretched everywhere else. Emily stared silently at the camera screen. "I've never seen anything like it." Harold hadn't either. Later that day, as Harold repaired a loose fence board, a polished black pickup stopped at the entrance to the farm. Victor Hale stepped out wearing pressed jeans and spotless boots that had seen little field work. Harold had known Victor for years. While older family farms struggled through drought after drought, Victor had steadily expanded his agricultural business by buying distressed properties. "Afternoon, Harold," Victor called pleasantly. "Thought I'd stop by." Harold leaned against the fence post. "What can I do for you?" Victor removed a folded document from his truck. "I'm making offers on several neighboring farms. Fair prices, considering the circumstances." Harold didn't reach for the paper. "I'm not selling. Think it over. 30 days from now, the bank may decide for you." Harold's expression remained calm. "The answer's still no." Victor studied the dry fields before speaking again. "You've had a good run here. Sometimes knowing when to let go is the wisest decision." Harold looked across the land his grandfather had cleared by hand. "Sometimes." Victor returned the unsigned offer to his pocket. "If you change your mind, call me before someone else makes the decision for you." He drove away in a cloud of dust. Emily watched from the porch. "He's counting on people giving up." Harold nodded. "I'm not ready." Early the next morning, Harold returned once again to the mysterious patch beneath the cloud. This time he carried a shovel. If moisture existed below the surface, he intended to find out why. He carefully removed the dry topsoil one layer at a time. A few inches down, the earth became noticeably darker. Duke stood nearby, watching quietly. Harold dug deeper. The shovel suddenly struck something solid with a sharp metallic crack. He froze, then slowly brushed away the loose dirt until the edge of a flat stone emerged from beneath the parched ground. Harold remained kneeling beside the shallow hole for several moments, staring at the flat stone his shovel had uncovered. The surface was smooth despite its age, unlike the rough limestone scattered naturally across the valley. He brushed away more dirt with his hands until a straight edge appeared. Whatever lay beneath the field had been placed there intentionally. Duke stepped closer, sniffing the exposed stone before sitting quietly beside him. Harold rested both hands on the shovel handle. "Looks like somebody wanted this buried," he murmured. Rather than forcing the stone free by himself, he covered the hole with an old canvas tarp to keep the morning sun from drying the exposed soil. Then he drove into town to find the one person who knew more about the county's history than anyone else. Clara Jennings had spent 30 years teaching history before retiring. Since then, she volunteered at the small historical society housed inside the old brick courthouse. Shelves overflowed with faded photographs, land surveys, newspaper clippings, and handwritten family records collected over generations. When Harold explained what he had found, Clara listened carefully without interrupting. "A worked stone beneath your eastern field," she repeated. "That's right. And the soil underneath is still damp." Harold nodded. Clara smiled with quiet curiosity. "That isn't something I'd ignore." She locked the office door, gathered a notebook, a measuring tape, and an old camera. Then followed Harold back to the farm. By late morning the tarp had been removed, and sunlight revealed more of the buried stone. Clara knelt beside it, brushing loose dirt away with a small paintbrush she carried in her bag. "These edges were cut by hand," she said. "Not recently." Either. Harold carefully widened the opening while Clara documented each layer. After nearly an hour of slow digging, another stone appeared beside the first. Then another. Together they formed the top of a narrow, stone-lined channel running beneath the cornfield. Harold stared in disbelief. "I've farmed this ground for 50 years. Clara smiled gently. "Sometimes land remembers things people forget." They removed another section of packed soil. The channel extended farther than either of them expected, disappearing beneath rows of struggling corn. The stones fit together with remarkable precision, leaving only narrow seams between them. Clara measured the width. This wasn't decorative. It was built to carry something. Harold looked down the length of the buried structure. "Water, possibly." She paused before adding, "Construction like this could easily be 70 years old, maybe older." Harold's thoughts drifted immediately to his father as a boy. He remembered watching him repair drainage ditches after heavy spring rains. His father rarely explained why certain places mattered more than others. He simply worked until the job was done. Harold had assumed those routines disappeared with him decades ago. Now he wasn't so sure. As they cleared another section, Harold's trowel scraped gently across the face of one stone. He brushed away the dirt and leaned closer. 3 weathered letters had been carved into the surface. H. W. His breath caught. Those initials matched his own name, but they had belonged to someone else first. His father, Henry Whitmore. Harold slowly reached out and rested his fingertips on the carving. He could almost imagine the older man's hands guiding the chisel so many years before. Clara remained silent, allowing the moment to settle. "He never told me about this," Harold finally whispered. "Maybe he planned to someday." Emily arrived that afternoon after Harold called and asked if she could stop by after work. She climbed from her truck expecting another discussion about bills or repairs. Instead, Harold led her directly to the excavation. She looked down into the exposed channel. "What is all this?" Harold pointed to the carved initials. Emily crouched beside him. "Those are Grandpa's." Harold nodded quietly. Emily traced the worn letters with one finger before looking at her father. The worry that had filled her face during recent weeks gave way to genuine curiosity. "You really think he built this?" "I don't know," Harold admitted, "but I think he knew about it." Emily looked across the field toward the green patch where the mysterious cloud continued appearing each morning. For the first time since the drought began, she wasn't telling Harold to give up. "Then we should keep looking." News of Harold's discovery spread faster than either of them expected. By the following day, Ben Carter stopped by, carrying shovels and cold lemonade. "Figured 2 people digging old rocks might appreciate another pair of hands," Harold smiled. "I'd appreciate the company." Together, they uncovered several more yards of the stone channel. It remained remarkably intact despite decades beneath the field. Every few feet, narrow openings branched away toward different sections of the property before disappearing beneath the soil. Ben wiped sweat from his forehead. Whoever built this knew exactly what they were doing. Harold looked thoughtfully across the land. "I just wish I'd asked more questions when my father was alive." Meanwhile, Victor Hale continued visiting neighboring farms. Trucks bearing his company logo appeared regularly along county roads as more struggling landowners accepted offers they never would have considered before the drought. One afternoon, Ben watched another family loading furniture into a trailer. "They're selling," he said quietly. Harold nodded without taking his eyes off the field. "They're doing what they think they have to." "Victor's buying almost everything." Harold tightened his grip on the shovel. "Not this place." That evening, after Ben left, Harold walked slowly through the farmhouse. Dust floated through fading sunlight pouring across familiar rooms. He found himself stopping outside the small study where his father had once kept ledgers, seed catalogs, and weather notes. Most of the shelves had been emptied years earlier. Old boxes lined one wall, each filled with faded receipts, broken lantern parts, rusted hinges, and family photographs. Harold began searching carefully, opening every drawer and lifting every lid. Emily joined him without saying a word. Together they sorted through decades of forgotten belongings. Finally, tucked inside the back of an old wooden cabinet beneath several folded county maps, Harold discovered a yellowed envelope. Inside was a single sheet of heavy paper covered with neat pencil lines. He unfolded it carefully across the desk. Emily leaned closer. The drawing showed the Whitmore farm from above. Thin lines stretched beneath the fields, connecting ponds, drainage routes, and stone channels marked with careful notes. Some paths ended at places Harold recognized, Others disappeared beyond areas he had never questioned. At the bottom of the page, written in Henry Whitmore's steady handwriting, were 4 simple words: Main underground water routes. Harold looked from the map to the window overlooking the eastern field, realizing that what lay beneath his farm was far larger than a single buried channel. Harold spread the yellowed map across the kitchen table before sunrise, weighting the corners with an old salt shaker, a coffee mug, and 2 worn seed catalogs. Emily stood beside him while Noah leaned forward with wide eyes, studying the careful pencil lines that crossed the drawing of the farm. Some routes followed the shape of familiar fields, while others curved through areas Harold had always considered ordinary pasture. Tiny handwritten notes appeared beside several lines, but years of age had faded many of the words beyond recognition. Harold traced one route with his finger until it ended near the eastern field, where the strange cloud continued to appear each morning. "This has to be the stone channel," he said quietly. Emily nodded. "If Grandpa drew it, maybe there are more." Harold folded the map carefully and slipped it into a clear plastic sleeve before placing it inside his jacket pocket. "Let's find out." The 3 of them walked toward the eastern field just as the familiar clouds settled over the small patch of greener corn. Noah lifted his camera and quietly photographed it again while Harold compared the map with the landscape around him. One line appeared to continue beyond the stone channel they had uncovered, disappearing toward an overgrown drainage ditch that had not carried visible water in decades. "I haven't cleaned that ditch since your grandfather passed," Harold admitted. Emily looked toward the tall weeds. "Then maybe that's where we start." They spent the morning cutting brush and clearing vines from the neglected ditch. The summer heat arrived early, forcing frequent breaks beneath the shade of an old oak tree. Duke wandered ahead, occasionally stopping to sniff along the ditch before moving forward again. After nearly 2 hours, Harold struck another flat stone, buried beneath roots and packed soil. This one formed the roof of a narrow tunnel running beneath the ditch itself. Unlike the first channel, several stones here had shifted over time. Loose dirt and collapsed sections blocked the passage completely. Harold crouched beside the opening. "This wasn't built for people," he said. "It was built to keep something moving." Emily looked into the darkness. "Water." Harold nodded slowly. "That's my guess." They worked carefully, removing only loose debris to avoid damaging the old structure. By midday, Ben Carter arrived with a wheelbarrow and 2 extra shovels. "Heard you might need another back," he said with a grin. Harold smiled. "You're becoming part of the family project." Ben laughed. "At my age, that's better than sitting around worrying." Together, the 4 of them removed fallen branches, broken stones, and decades of accumulated silt. As more of the tunnel opened, faint dampness appeared along the lower stones. Ben reached down and touched the surface. Still cool. Harold ran his hand across the same spot. The moisture wasn't flowing, but the stone felt noticeably colder than the surrounding earth. "Something's trapped behind this blockage," he said. They continued working until Harold finally loosened a large stone wedged near the center of the tunnel. With Ben's help, they rolled it aside. At first, nothing happened. Then a thin trickle of clear water slipped through the opening, winding quietly along the bottom of the stone channel before disappearing beneath another section farther downhill. No one spoke for several seconds. Emily smiled first. "It's moving." Harold watched the narrow stream with quiet disbelief. It wasn't enough to irrigate a field, but after months without meaningful rain, even that small flow felt miraculous. "Dad would have known exactly where this was," he said softly. Ben nodded. "Looks like he wanted somebody to find it someday." Over the next several days, Harold followed the map whenever time allowed. Each marked location revealed another piece of the forgotten system. Some channels remained intact, while others had collapsed beneath years of neglect. Most required only clearing roots or removing fallen stones before allowing small amounts of water to pass again. None of it explained the strange cloud. But each discovery made Harold feel closer to understanding his father's work. Meanwhile, Clara Jennings searched through county records at the Historical Society. One afternoon, she arrived carrying a folder thick with photocopies. Harold welcomed her onto the porch where Emily and Noah were sorting tools. Clara spread several old documents across the table. I found references to your father in county engineering reports from the early 1960s. Harold leaned closer. Engineering reports? Not official employment, Clara explained. More like advisory meetings during an earlier drought. She handed him one yellowed page. Henry Whitmore's name appeared among several local farmers invited to discuss water conservation projects. Another document mentioned proposed drainage improvements across the valley. But several pages that should have followed were missing from the archive. Missing? Emily asked. Clara nodded. The index lists additional records, but they're gone. Harold looked thoughtfully toward the fields. Maybe they were never filed, or maybe they were removed. Clara replied carefully. She offered no further speculation. The papers revealed only that Henry Whitmore had participated in planning discussions decades earlier. Nothing explained why those discussions had ended or why so many records had disappeared. Harold placed the documents beside the map inside the farmhouse. That evening he walked once more through the eastern field. The small green patch had grown wider than before. The surrounding corn still struggled, but healthy color now reached several additional rows. Even Ben noticed the difference when he stopped by the following morning. Looks like it's spreading. Harold smiled faintly. Slowly. Ben examined the plants. Healthier than anything I've got. Harold knelt and pushed his fingers into the soil. The moisture extended farther than it had only a week earlier. Whatever the buried channels were doing, they were beginning to influence more of the field. That discovery filled him with cautious hope, though he knew it remained far too early to celebrate. Later that afternoon, Noah wandered into the old barn while searching for extra fence nails. The loft above was crowded with forgotten crates, broken furniture, rusted machinery, and dusty boxes that had not been touched in years. He climbed halfway up the ladder, shining a flashlight across the shadows. "Grandpa," he called. Harold looked up from below. "Find something?" Noah brushed dust from an old wooden shelf. "Not sure." He reached toward a narrow gap behind several weathered storage boxes. His fingers touched empty space where another object should have rested. Wedged against the wall was a single brittle sheet of paper caught beneath a loose board. Noah carefully pulled it free and carried it downstairs. Harold unfolded the fragile page. Most of the writing had faded beyond recognition, but one sentence remained clear enough to read. For complete instructions, see the main journal. Harold searched the rest of the page, but there was nothing to indicate where that journal had been stored. Emily looked around the silent barn. If there was a journal, where did it go? Harold folded the page carefully, his eyes moving slowly across shelves filled with decades of forgotten belongings. Somewhere his father's missing journal had once existed, and if it was still on the farm, it might hold the answers they had been searching for. Harold carried the faded page from the barn into the farmhouse as if it were made of glass. He laid it beside the map and Clara's copied records on the kitchen table, while Emily carefully smoothed the curling corners. The single surviving sentence, "For complete instructions, see the main journal," refused to leave Harold's mind. If his father had written detailed instructions, they had to be somewhere on the farm. Henry Whitmore had never been the kind of man who threw important things away. Every bolt, every receipt, every notebook had always found a place. Harold simply had to remember where. The following morning, Noah arrived before breakfast, his old camera hanging around his neck as usual. "Can we search the barn again?" he asked eagerly. Harold smiled over his coffee. "I was hoping you'd ask." Emily looked at both of them before shaking her head with a small laugh. "You two aren't giving up, are you?" Harold folded the map into his pocket. "Not anymore." They began in the barn loft, moving slowly through decades of stored belongings. Dust coated every shelf. Wooden crates held rusted horseshoes, broken lanterns, and faded seed sacks from companies that no longer existed. Noah examined each box carefully instead of rushing. Harold admired the boy's patience. It reminded him of Henry, who had always believed that careful work saved time in the end. Hours passed without success. Then Noah noticed something unusual near the back wall. A weathered metal toolbox sat tucked beneath an old wagon seat, hidden behind stacked lumber. Unlike everything around it, the lid carried only a thin layer of dust, as though someone had handled it long ago before pushing it out of sight. "Grandpa?" Noah called softly. "I found something." Harold climbed into the loft and knelt beside the box. The metal latch had rusted, but after a little effort it opened with a sharp creak. Inside lay neatly arranged hand tools wrapped in oilcloth. Beneath them rested a thick notebook bound in worn brown leather. Harold froze. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted it free. The cover bore no title, only the initials H.W. pressed into one corner. Emily looked over his shoulder. "That's Grandpa's handwriting." Harold carefully opened the first page. Every sheet was filled with neat entries dated more than 60 years earlier. Weather observations, rainfall measurements, notes about soil conditions, sketches of drainage channels. The handwriting was unmistakably Henry Whitmore's. Harold smiled for the first time in weeks. "We found it." They carried the journal inside before reading another page at the kitchen table. Harold turned through the entries one by one. Henry had recorded temperatures, wind direction, and rainfall almost every day. Between those observations appeared detailed notes describing shallow ponds, stone-lined channels, tree belts, and natural drainage routes designed to slow water instead of letting it escape after storms. There were no machines or complicated inventions. Everything relied on careful shaping of the land itself. Emily looked at one sketch, showing small earth embankments guiding runoff toward underground channels. "He built all this." Harold nodded slowly. "I had no idea." Another page described restoring soil moisture naturally by capturing every possible drop of rain during wet seasons so the ground would release that moisture gradually during dry periods. Harold remembered helping his father dig ditches as a boy without ever understanding why some projects seemed so important. Henry had rarely explained his reasons. He simply expected the work to be done well. Harold turned another page. "Listen to this," he read aloud. "The land stores more water than people believe. Protect the ground, and the ground protects the crops." Emily smiled. "That sounds exactly like him." Noah pointed toward another paragraph describing rows of trees planted to reduce evaporation and encourage moisture to remain over nearby fields. "So the system wasn't just underground?" "No," Harold answered. "It was everything working together." The journal continued describing practical improvements rather than miracles. Nothing suggested the mysterious cloud directly, yet every page revealed how carefully Henry had studied the land for years. Harold felt both pride and regret. Pride in what his father had accomplished, regret that he had never asked enough questions while Henry was still alive to answer them. A few days later, another envelope arrived from the county courthouse. Harold opened it on the porch while Emily watered flowers that somehow continued blooming despite the drought. His expression hardened as he finished reading. Emily noticed immediately. "What is it?" Harold handed her the letter. Victor Hale's company had filed paperwork questioning whether any restored water system beneath the property could affect surrounding drainage rights. The notice required Harold to provide documentation before making further alterations. Emily frowned. "Can he do this?" "He can ask." Harold folded the letter carefully. "Doesn't mean he'll win." Ben arrived later that afternoon carrying fresh bread his wife had baked. After reading the notice, he sighed. "Victor isn't buying your farm, so now he's looking for another way to pressure you." Harold nodded but remained calm. "We're only clearing old channels that already existed." Ben looked toward the eastern field where the greener patch had expanded another few rows. "Looks like somebody noticed." Emily stepped closer to her father. "Then we'll answer with facts." Harold appreciated hearing those words. Only weeks earlier, she had wanted him to sell the farm and walk away. Now she was standing beside him. Over the following days, Emily spent every spare evening helping Harold compare the journal with the old map. Together, they matched Henry's notes to landmarks still visible across the property. Noah carefully labeled photographs of each restored channel. Clara examined the journal as well, confirming that its dates matched the surviving county records she had found. Piece by piece, the forgotten history became clearer. One evening, Harold reached the final section of the journal. The handwriting had become slightly shakier, suggesting Henry wrote those entries later in life. Several pages described one last project that had never been fully explained elsewhere. Harold read silently for several moments before stopping. Emily noticed his expression. "What did you find?" Harold slowly turned the journal toward her. Near the bottom of the page, Henry had written one final instruction beneath a simple, hand-drawn symbol. "If drought ever returns, begin with the last reservoir." Harold looked through the remaining pages, but there was no map showing its location. Only the name remained, waiting to be understood. Harold read the final line in his father's journal several more times before closing the worn leather cover. "If drought ever returns, begin with the last reservoir." The words were clear enough, but they offered no directions. Emily looked across the kitchen table at the map spread beneath the journal. "Do you think it's marked somewhere?" Harold shook his head slowly. "Not by that name." Clara adjusted her glasses as she compared the map with several copied county records. Henry was methodical. If he didn't draw it directly, he probably assumed anyone who understood the rest of the system would eventually recognize where to look. Harold nodded thoughtfully. His father had always believed that knowledge earned through careful observation lasted longer than knowledge simply handed over. He folded the journal gently and slipped it into a cloth bag before looking toward the woods beyond the eastern fields. Several drainage lines on the map seemed to angle toward that direction before disappearing beneath the tree line. "That's where we'll start." The next morning, Harold, Emily, Noah, Ben, and Duke crossed the edge of the farm and entered the narrow strip of woodland bordering the property. The summer heat lingered beneath the trees, but the shade offered welcome relief from the relentless sun. Noah carried his camera while Emily held the map inside a clear plastic sleeve. Ben brought 2 shovels and a pruning saw. Harold carried the journal in his backpack. They moved slowly, stopping whenever Harold recognized an old landmark from childhood. Fallen fence posts, moss-covered stones, and abandoned paths stirred memories he had not visited in decades. "Dad used to bring me through here after heavy rains," Harold said quietly. "I thought we were just checking fences." Emily smiled. "Maybe you were checking something much bigger." They followed a shallow depression, winding through the woods until Ben pointed toward a cluster of unusually large stones. "That look familiar?" Harold studied the area. Thick brush covered most of the ground, but beneath the vines he noticed a curved earth embankment stretching through the trees. It looked too smooth to be natural. "Help me clear this." They spent nearly 2 hours cutting weeds and removing fallen branches. As the undergrowth disappeared, the shape became unmistakable. A broad, shallow basin spread across the forest floor, surrounded by carefully built earthen banks reinforced with stone. Time had hidden it beneath leaves and brush, but its design remained visible. Noah climbed onto one of the embankments and looked down. "It's huge!" Clara had described historical water retention ponds during earlier droughts, and Harold suddenly understood what he was seeing. "This isn't a pond," he said softly. "It's a reservoir." Emily slowly turned in a circle, taking in the size of the hidden basin. "The last reservoir." Harold smiled, though emotion tightened his voice. "I think your grandfather wanted it hidden in plain sight." They walked around the edge together. At one end, Harold found the remains of a stone outlet, almost completely blocked by decades of mud, roots, and fallen branches. The narrow channel matched the direction shown on the old map. Ben knelt beside it. "If this connects to the channels under your fields," Harold nodded, "then this may have supplied the whole system." Without hesitation, they began clearing the blockage. The work was slow. Tree roots had grown through the stonework, and years of packed silt filled the channel. Ben used the pruning saw while Harold loosened stones one by one. Emily and Noah carried away debris in buckets. Duke rested beneath a nearby oak, watching quietly. By late afternoon, Harold finally reached a thick wall of compacted mud lodged deep inside the outlet. He drove the shovel into it several times before the packed earth gave way with a muffled crack. Everyone stepped back. At first, there was only silence. Then a narrow stream of clear water emerged from the darkness behind the blockage. It trickled across the stone floor before gathering into a steady flow that disappeared into the old channel leading toward the farm. Noah grinned. "It's working." Ben laughed for the first time in weeks. "I'll be darned." Harold crouched beside the flowing water, letting it run over his weathered fingers. It was cool and clean. His father had built something meant to last generations. They followed the channel back toward the fields over the next several days, clearing smaller blockages wherever they appeared. The work attracted attention. Ben invited 2 neighboring farmers whose own crops were failing. They arrived carrying tools without being asked twice. Soon, half a dozen volunteers worked together each evening after tending their own struggling land. Nobody spoke much about miracles. They simply worked, because hope had finally returned in a practical form. As more sections reopened, moisture slowly spread through the surrounding soil. Harold noticed the difference first in the eastern field. The healthy patch widened another several rows. Plants that had seemed beyond saving lifted their leaves slightly during the cooler mornings. Ben reported similar changes near the edge of his adjoining property. "Not enough to call it recovery," he said, "but enough to keep believing." Emily looked across the fields one evening as the familiar cloud settled once again above Harold's land. It seemed slightly broader now, casting shade over a larger area than before. "Do you think restoring the system is changing something?" Harold watched the cloud quietly. "Maybe the land is remembering what it was built to do." Clara visited later that week to examine the restored reservoir. After comparing it with Henry's journal, she smiled with quiet satisfaction. "Your father wasn't trying to control nature," she said. "He was working with it." Harold looked across the basin where water now rested peacefully behind the rebuilt outlet. "He never wanted credit." "Some people build monuments," Clara replied. "Others leave systems that keep helping long after they're gone." The volunteers continued restoring channels until nearly sunset each evening. No one asked for payment. The work belonged to everyone now. Just as Harold finished placing the final stone back into the outlet wall one afternoon, the sound of approaching engines echoed along the farm road. Several county vehicles rolled to a stop near the eastern field. Victor Hale stepped out first, followed by 2 county officials carrying folders and surveying equipment. Harold set down his shovel and quietly wiped the dirt from his hands as the group began walking toward the restored channel. Harold rested both hands on the top of his shovel as Victor Hale crossed the field with 2 county officials close behind. The volunteers stopped working one by one. Ben leaned his shovel against a fence post while Emily stepped beside her father without saying a word. Noah quietly lifted his camera. Duke remained seated near the restored channel, watching the strangers approach. Victor offered a polite smile that never reached his eyes. "Good afternoon. Harold, Victor," one of the county officials unfolded a clipboard. "Mr. Whitmore, we've received concerns regarding excavation work and possible alterations to historical drainage routes. We're here to inspect the site." Harold nodded calmly. "You're welcome to look at everything." He led them toward the restored stone channel beneath the eastern field. Water continued moving quietly through the narrow passage, exactly as it had since the blockage had been cleared. The officials examined the exposed stones, measured the channel, and compared its direction with old county maps they had brought. One inspector looked at Harold. "When was this built?" "Long before I owned the farm," Harold answered honestly. "My father constructed or restored much of it decades ago." Victor folded his arms. "The question isn't when it was built. It's whether reopening these channels changes water flow, affecting neighboring properties." Ben stepped forward. "Nothing here is taking water away from anybody. We've watched it for days." The official raised a hand. "We'll hear everyone." Harold walked back to the farmhouse and returned, carrying Henry's journal, the original map, and Clara's copies of county records. He placed everything carefully on the hood of his pickup. "These belong to my father," he said. "The channels already existed. We've only cleared blockages caused by neglect." Clara, who had arrived shortly before the inspection began, pointed toward the documents. "The journal dates match the county records I located. Henry Whitmore discussed conservation projects during the early 1960s. The surviving files support that." One official slowly turned several pages of the journal. He paused over detailed sketches showing reservoirs, drainage routes, and natural water retention methods. "These notes are remarkably thorough." Victor glanced toward the greener section of corn. "Regardless of age, the county should determine whether this restoration provides an unfair advantage." Harold answered quietly. "An advantage." He gestured toward the surrounding fields, where drought still dominated the landscape. "We've invited neighbors to help restore the system. Nothing here belongs only to me." Ben nodded immediately. "He's right. Harold never closed the gates. We've all been working together." The inspectors continued examining the channels for another hour. They found no pumps, no modern diversions, and no evidence that water had been redirected away from neighboring farms. Everything relied on gravity, natural drainage, and old stone construction. Before leaving, the senior official closed his folder. "We'll prepare our report after reviewing the records. Until then, avoid expanding beyond existing historical structures." Harold agreed without argument. The vehicles disappeared down the gravel road, leaving the volunteers standing quietly in the fading afternoon light. Emily looked toward her father. "I think that went better than Victor hoped." Harold smiled faintly. "Facts usually speak more clearly than arguments." News of the inspection spread quickly through the county. At the next community meeting, farmers gathered inside the old Grange Hall to discuss the worsening drought and the future of their land. Some had already sold their farms. Others were considering it. Victor addressed the room first. He spoke confidently about large-scale investment, efficient management, and financial security. "Small operations simply cannot survive disasters like this forever," he said. "Consolidating resources protects the future." Several people nodded. Others remained silent when Harold entered with Emily. Ben, Clara, and Noah, conversations stopped. Harold had never enjoyed speaking before crowds, but he stood anyway. Instead of making promises, he placed Henry's journal and the old map on the front table. Clara explained the historical records she had uncovered. She carefully described the forgotten conservation work without exaggeration. Harold then spoke about restoring existing channels rather than creating new ones. My father believed the land could hold more water if we stopped letting every storm wash away what little we received, he said. We aren't fighting nature. We're remembering how to work with it. A farmer near the back raised his hand. Can anyone learn this system? Harold answered without hesitation. If it helps keep another family on their farm, yes. Emily stepped beside her father before anyone else could speak. A few weeks ago, I begged him to sell this place. I thought protecting him meant leaving everything behind. She looked across the room. I was wrong. What he's rebuilding isn't just for our family. It belongs to the history of this valley. The room grew quiet. Several farmers who had worked alongside Harold nodded in agreement. Even those who remained uncertain listened respectfully. Victor said nothing more. After the meeting ended, Noah walked outside with Ben. The evening sky glowed orange above the fields. The familiar cloud lingered over the Whitmore farm in the distance. Noah reviewed the photographs stored on his camera. Curious, he opened the oldest images he had taken during the first week. Then he compared them with newer ones. Grandpa? He called as Harold stepped onto the porch of the hall. Harold joined him. Noah scrolled carefully through the dates displayed beneath each picture. Look! The earliest photographs clearly showed the lone cloud above the eastern field before the family had restored the reservoir, before volunteers had cleared the larger channels, and before any significant repairs had begun. Harold studied each image. The cloud had been there from the beginning. Ben looked over Noah's shoulder. That settles one question. Emily smiled gently. People can't say the cloud appeared because we rebuilt everything. Harold closed the camera carefully and handed it back to Noah. Keep every picture safe. Noah nodded proudly. They might become important someday. The following afternoon, a brief notice arrived from the county office. The officials had completed their initial inspection but required additional review of the historical documentation before issuing a final decision regarding the restored conservation system. No approval, no rejection. Only more waiting. Harold folded the notice and slipped it into his pocket. He looked across the field where volunteers quietly resumed their work while the small cloud drifted patiently above the growing patch of healthy corn. The future of the farm now rested not only on the weather, but on a decision that had yet to be made. Harold unfolded the county notice once more before slipping it into the same shirt pocket that had carried the foreclosure letter only weeks earlier. The words offered neither victory nor defeat. The officials simply needed more time. For now, the restored channels could remain open, provided no additional work extended beyond the original system. It wasn't the certainty Harold wanted, but it was enough to keep working. The next morning, the familiar cloud returned before sunrise. Harold stood beside the eastern field with Duke at his side, watching its dark edges drift slowly across a larger stretch of corn than ever before. The patch of healthy plants had nearly doubled since they reopened the last reservoir. The difference wasn't dramatic enough for someone driving past to notice, but Harold saw it immediately. Leaves that had once curled tightly now reached toward the morning light. The soil beneath them held moisture several inches below the surface. Emily joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. It's getting bigger, she said quietly, looking toward the cloud. Harold nodded. So is the green. Emily smiled. Grandpa would have liked seeing this. Harold took a slow sip before answering. I think he expected someone would. Throughout the week, the volunteers continued restoring only the remaining sections shown on Henry's map. No new channels were dug. Every repair simply reopened stonework that had been buried beneath decades of neglect. Ben organized small crews so no one became exhausted in the summer heat. Farmers who had once worked only their own land now shared tools, meals, and labor without keeping track of who owed what. Harold noticed the change as clearly as he noticed the healthier corn. The drought had nearly broken the community. Working together was slowly putting it back together. One afternoon, Ben walked across the property carrying a handful of fresh corn leaves from his own field. "Take a look." Harold examined them carefully. They were still thinner than a healthy crop should have been, but the edges no longer crumbled from dryness. "You've got new growth," Ben nodded. "Just along the side nearest your property." Harold smiled. "The moisture's spreading." Ben looked across both farms. "Maybe your father knew the valley better than anyone realized." The improvement wasn't limited to Ben's land. Within days, 2 other neighboring farmers reported cooler soil near restored drainage routes connected to the original system. None claimed miracles. Their fields still desperately needed rain. Yet the plants had stopped declining as quickly. For the first time in months, conversations centered on saving crops instead of selling farms. Victor Hale noticed the change as well. His trucks appeared less frequently along the county roads. Several families who had planned to sell asked for more time before signing contracts. Harold heard about it from Ben while they repaired a stone retaining wall near the reservoir. "People aren't as eager to give up anymore," Ben said. Harold rested another stone into place. "Hope has a way of changing decisions." Victor himself drove past the Whitmore farm twice that week, but never stopped. He slowed near the entrance each time, studying the greener rows before continuing down the road. Harold simply returned to his work. The fields would speak for themselves. One evening, Clara arrived carrying several photocopies she had made from Henry's journal for safekeeping. "I thought you might want copies before the originals become too fragile." Harold thanked her and carefully placed them inside a folder. As they organized the papers, a small, folded sheet slipped unnoticed from between 2 journal pages and drifted onto the kitchen floor. Noah spotted it first. "Grandpa, something fell out." Harold unfolded the brittle page with great care. It appeared to have been tucked into the journal years after the other entries were written. Most of the notes repeated measurements already found elsewhere. But along the bottom margin, Henry had added one final sentence in darker pencil. "Never forget the trees. They hold the sky close to the land." Emily looked puzzled. "What do you think he meant?" Harold looked through the kitchen window toward the long rows of mature trees surrounding portions of the farm. "Those windbreaks," Clara nodded thoughtfully. "Tree belts reduce evaporation and help retain moisture. Farmers understood that long before modern equipment." Harold smiled softly. "Dad always planted trees where everyone else thought they wasted land." Noah glanced toward the eastern field where the cloud floated quietly above the corn. "Maybe they weren't wasting anything." Harold carefully placed the loose page inside a protective sleeve with the rest of the journal. It wasn't a new mystery. It simply completed another piece of Henry's careful thinking. Every decision had been connected to the next. The channels, the reservoir, the trees, the shape of the fields. Nothing had been accidental. As the week continued, the mysterious cloud seemed broader each morning. Instead of shading only a handful of rows, it now covered much of the eastern field before slowly fading after sunrise. The weather itself remained painfully dry. Day after day, temperatures climbed while nearby farms waited anxiously for forecasts to change. Late Friday afternoon, Harold switched on the old radio inside the workshop while repairing a gate hinge. The local weather report interrupted the music. "The extended forecast continues to show extreme heat across the county. No measurable rainfall is expected during the next 7 days." Harold lowered his wrench and listened as the announcer repeated the forecast. 7 more days, Emily, who had been sorting tools nearby, heard it too. Neither of them spoke immediately. They both understood what another week without rain could mean. Even with the restored system helping the soil retain precious moisture, Harold stepped outside as evening settled across the valley. The healthy corn stood stronger than it had only weeks before, yet it still depended on rain eventually arriving. Above the eastern field, the lone cloud drifted silently in the fading light. Larger than ever, as if waiting for something the rest of the sky had not yet decided to do. The seventh day arrived beneath another cloudless sunrise. Harold stepped onto the porch before dawn with a cup of black coffee warming his hands. The forecast had been right every day that week. Endless heat, dry wind, no measurable rain. Yet the eastern field still held its quiet resilience. The greener rows remained standing while much of the surrounding valley faded toward brown. Duke settled beside him as the familiar lone cloud slowly gathered above the field once again. It no longer seemed like a small patch of shade. Its edges stretched farther each morning, lingering over the restored channels and the healthiest corn before the rising sun slowly dissolved its outline. Harold watched without trying to explain it. Whatever his father had built into the land was doing exactly what it had been designed to do. Emily joined him a few minutes later. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. Harold smiled faintly. "Too much waiting." She looked across the fields. "I keep thinking about Grandpa writing all those notes and never telling anyone. Maybe he believed the land would explain it better than he could." They walked through the eastern rows together. Harold pushed his fingers beneath the surface. The soil still held cool moisture below the dry crust. Not enough to replace rain, enough to buy precious time. Emily looked toward neighboring farms. "Everyone else is waiting too." Ben arrived shortly after sunrise, carrying his weather radio. His face revealed little hope. "Forecast hasn't changed," he said. "Still no rain today." Harold nodded. "We'll keep working anyway." The volunteers spent the morning clearing loose debris from the final restored channels and reinforcing small sections of stone that recent water flow had weakened. No one complained about the heat anymore. They had accepted it as another part of the job. Between tasks, they checked the crops. Harold noticed ears beginning to form on plants he had assumed would never survive. Ben found similar signs along the edge of his own property. "They're small," Ben admitted, "but they're alive." Harold smiled. "Sometimes that's enough." Around noon, Noah wandered through the eastern field, taking another series of photographs. He had documented the cloud almost every morning since the day Harold first noticed it. Looking through the camera, he frowned. "Grandpa." Harold walked over. Noah pointed toward the western horizon. A distant line of pale gray clouds had begun forming far beyond the hills. They were thin at first, almost blending into the haze. Harold looked from them back to the familiar cloud above his own field. For several quiet minutes, nothing changed. Then the breeze shifted. Emily felt it first. "That's different." The hot wind that had dominated the valley for weeks softened into cooler air. Leaves across the cornfield rustled together. Ben removed his cap and looked skyward. The distant clouds slowly advanced. As they approached the valley, the lone cloud above Harold's field no longer remained isolated. Its edges stretched outward until they touched the larger weather front moving from the west. Noah lowered his camera only long enough to stare with his own eyes. "They're joining." Harold said nothing. He simply watched the sky. The first drop landed on the back of his hand. It was so small he almost doubted it had happened. Then another struck the dusty ground beside his boot. Emily laughed softly. Ben looked upward with a smile that carried weeks of exhaustion. Within moments, scattered drops became steady rain. It wasn't violent. There was no thunder, no dramatic wind, just gentle, soaking rainfall spreading across the valley. Dust disappeared almost instantly. Dry soil darkened. Water gathered quietly inside the restored channels before flowing toward the reservoir, exactly as Henry's journal had described decades earlier. Harold closed his eyes as cool rain soaked his hat and shoulders. He could not remember the last time simple weather had made him feel this grateful. Around him, the volunteers stood silently, letting the rain fall. Some laughed. One elderly farmer wiped tears from his face, without bothering to hide them. Ben reached over and squeezed Harold's shoulder. "You kept believing." Harold shook his head gently. "My father did. I just followed the path he left." The rain continued for nearly 2 hours, never becoming heavy enough to wash away soil, only steady enough to soak deeply into the thirsty ground. By evening, the fields looked transformed. The restored channels carried excess water exactly where they were meant to go. Small ponds within the woodland reservoir filled gradually without overflowing. The young corn stood straighter than it had in months. During the following days, the change became unmistakable. Healthy growth spread across Harold's fields. Ben's crops recovered along the restored drainage routes. Neighboring farmers reported similar improvements wherever old conservation features had been reopened. No one claimed every acre had been saved, but enough had survived to give families real hope again. Victor Hale's trucks disappeared from the county roads. Conversations in town shifted from selling land to preparing for harvest. One quiet afternoon, Harold walked through the eastern field with Noah. The boys stopped beside the tallest rows of corn. "Grandpa, do you think Grandpa Henry knew this would happen?" Harold looked across the field before answering. "I think he knew that if people cared for the land, someday the land would care for them." Noah smiled and took one more photograph. Late that afternoon, the mail truck stopped beside the farmhouse. The driver stepped onto the porch holding a single official envelope from the county. "Looks important," he said. Harold thanked him and turned the envelope over in his hands. The county seal stood clearly across the front. Emily noticed it through the kitchen window and stepped outside. Ben, who had been repairing a fence nearby, walked toward the porch as well. Harold looked at the envelope for a long moment before carefully breaking the seal. Harold unfolded the county letter slowly while Emily, Ben, and Noah waited in silence. The paper carried the official seal, but the words inside were warmer than he expected. After reviewing the historical records, Henry Whitmore's journal, Clara's documentation, and the inspection reports, the county formally recognized the restored channels reservoir and drainage network as a historic conservation system. The letter authorized continued restoration using the original design and announced that the county board had voted to establish a preservation program so other farms could learn from the methods Henry had developed decades earlier. Harold lowered the paper without speaking. Emily smiled first. He finally got the recognition he never asked for. Harold nodded quietly. He would have said the land deserved it more than he did. Clara arrived later that afternoon after receiving a call from the county office. She carried another folder containing copies of the official resolution. "They've approved funding," she said. "Not just for your farm. They want to document the entire conservation system so it can be restored throughout the valley." Harold looked across the fields where volunteers were finishing the last small repairs. "Dad always hoped the work would help everyone." Clara smiled. "Now it will." News spread quickly. Farmers who had once gathered to discuss selling their land now met to organize restoration projects before the next planting season. Ben volunteered to coordinate work crews, younger farmers offered equipment, while retired neighbors shared memories of drainage ditches, ponds, and tree belts that had disappeared over the years. Instead of arguing about who owned the future, people began rebuilding it together. A week later, Victor Hale stopped by the Whitmore farm one final time. He stepped out of his truck without documents or contracts in his hands. Harold met him near the gate. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Finally, Victor glanced across the healthy corn. "Looks like I underestimated your father." Harold answered honestly, "So did I." Victor nodded once. "Several families withdrew their sales agreements. I heard." Victor looked toward the restored fields before offering a small, respectful smile. "I suppose that's good for the valley." Harold extended his hand. After a brief hesitation, Victor shook it. There was nothing more to argue about. The trucks bearing his company's logo gradually disappeared from the county roads. Summer slowly gave way to early autumn. The corn that many believed would never survive matured into full golden rows stretching across the Whitmore farm. Not every acre produced perfectly. Some sections had suffered too much before the rain arrived. Yet the harvest exceeded every expectation anyone had dared to keep after the drought. Combines rolled steadily through the fields while neighbors helped one another bring crops in before cooler weather arrived. Harold climbed into the old combine one crisp morning with Noah riding beside him. The boy looked across the sea of golden corn. "It's beautiful." Harold smiled. "It sure is." As the machine moved forward, golden ears poured into the grain tank. Harold remembered standing in the same field only weeks earlier, believing he might lose everything his family had built. Now, every pass through the rows reminded him that hope sometimes grew quietly, one careful choice at a time. Emily visited almost every day during harvest. One evening, after the last wagon had been unloaded, she stood beside her father outside the farmhouse. "I've been thinking," she said. Harold looked toward her. "About what? Noah loves this place. So do I." She hesitated before continuing. "I'd like us to spend more time here. Maybe, eventually even move back." Harold studied her face, seeing the same determination he remembered in Henry years before. "You don't have to do it for me," Emily smiled. I'm doing it because this farm still has a future." Noah overheard the conversation as he carried camera equipment toward the porch. "Does that mean I get to help every summer?" Harold laughed. "Only if you're ready for early mornings." "I am." Duke barked once, as though approving the arrangement. During the county's annual harvest celebration, local officials invited Harold to speak. He stood before neighbors he had known most of his life, with Henry's weather journal resting in his hands. "Most people think an inheritance is land, money, or buildings," Harold said quietly. "I thought that once too. But my father left something far more valuable. He left knowledge. He taught this land how to hold on to water, and he trusted that someday someone would understand why." He paused, looking across the familiar faces. "If this valley has learned anything from this drought, I hope it's that we grow stronger when we care for the land and for each other." The applause that followed belonged as much to Henry Whitmore as it did to Harold. Later that afternoon, the county unveiled a small historical marker near the restored reservoir. It did not celebrate a miracle. It simply honored generations of practical stewardship and recognized the conservation system that had helped protect the valley during one of its hardest seasons. Harold ran his hand gently across the engraved plaque before walking back toward the fields. Weeks later, with harvest complete and the grain safely stored, Harold stood beside Emily, Noah, Ben, Clara, and Duke near the eastern edge of the farm. The corn shimmered beneath the soft light of a cool autumn afternoon. The foreclosure notice that had once lived in Harold's pocket had long since been replaced by paid receipts and renewed confidence. Financial stability had returned with the harvest, but that was no longer what mattered most to him. He looked across the tree belts his father had planted, the restored channels hidden beneath the fields, and the quiet reservoir resting beneath the woods. Every part of the farm carried Henry's patient wisdom. Harold finally lifted his eyes toward the sky. The lone cloud that had watched over the eastern field each morning was nowhere to be seen. Above him stretched an open blue sky, calm and bright. He smiled gently. The cloud had never been magic. It had simply been one small sign of a landscape slowly remembering how to breathe. Shaped by reservoirs, stone channels, healthy soil, protective tree belts, and decades of careful stewardship that allowed moisture to rise naturally over the Whitmore farm once the forgotten system had been restored, its purpose had never been to perform a miracle. Its purpose had been to lead him back to the legacy his father had quietly left behind. Harold slipped Henry's journal beneath one arm as Noah reached for his grandfather's hand. Together, surrounded by family and neighbors, he looked across the golden fields stretching toward the horizon and realized that the greatest inheritance he had ever received had never been the farm itself. It was the wisdom to care for it well enough that future generations could one day call it home.